So who is known as the greatest Christian philosopher? We are going to talk about him today. We are going through a book by Ken Samples of Reasons to Believe. It is called Classic Christian Thinkers, an Introduction. We've been going through that for a little while now. We have a few more to go after this one. So if you don't have the book, I have a link to the description below. We are going to talk about Thomas Aquinas today. He is one of my favorite Christian thinkers. I have come to learn a lot about him and love him and his works. Over the last few years, we highly regard him at Southern Evangelical Seminary and think that he is a great thinker, of course. And people will say, well, how can you think that if you're a Protestant? He's Catholic. Well, because here's how I describe this. We are Thomistic. We're not full-blown Thomists in the sense that because we're not Catholic, but we think that Thomas has a lot of great things to offer. So the way I describe it is saying well, we are Thomistic really regarding his issues of general revelation, not so much his issues of that rely specifically on special revelation. What does that mean? Well, general revelation or natural revelation is what we know about God and theology from the world around us. And we know that there are certain things we can know about God through nature, and certainly we can know about ourselves and reality. One, just because that's our experience, that's just is plain, obviously. And of course, people will debate that, but I think they're wrong on that. And Paul says we can do this in Romans chapter 1, that we can know certain things about God through what has been made. And so Paul is saying we can do natural theology and general religion. So it doesn't matter whether you live in Africa, Asia, South America, North America, it doesn't matter. We live all in the same reality. We all have the same human nature, and we can know certain things about our reality, and we can know certain things about God as well. So when it comes to these general truths that we can all glean, no matter where we live and no matter when we live, I think Aquinas is right here. We can see other people who say the same thing, who say things that also are true, I think. Somebody's not wrong because he's not a Christian on certain things. We can't, it's not like we say that Aristotle's wrong about all things because he wasn't a Christian, or that somebody else who wasn't a Christian we shouldn't listen to because he wasn't a Christian. There are certain things that we can know through just natural reason and revelation, because God made us rational creatures so that we can know certain things about the world around us and about our Creator and about ourselves. So those are the ways that we appreciate Thomas Aquinas. And of course, if you're a Christian, you agree with Aquinas on a lot of things too, that Jesus is God, the Bible is true. Of course, they have more books than we do as Protestants. You believe that the Trinity is true, that Jesus saves, and a whole host of things. So we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to test and see, okay, what is Aquinas saying that's good and bad? And we're going to discuss today some of his overall achievements and his contributions. And of course, we don't hold everything that Aquinas taught as being true because he is Catholic. And hey, I don't believe everything I teach sometimes, and I change my mind on my own stuff too. So Aquinas was born in 1224 or 1225. There's some dispute about the date, and died in 1274. So a relatively short life, but wrote a lot, had a lot of influence and impact. Some of his major writings include the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles, as well as many commentaries on the Bible, on different people throughout history, such as Aristotle and Peter Abelard and all kinds of different people. But his main works are the Summa Theologiae, or the Sum of Theology, and the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a work of apologetics, mainly against the Muslims, but it would include anybody who is not a Christian. So the Sum of Theology, or the Summa Theologiae, is a work that was really meant to be for beginners, and we who have read some of this and study it and teach it laugh at that because it's very complicated. It's a very in-depth book. To think it was written for beginners is hilarious, because people who are scholars today have a hard time understanding what Aquinas says there a lot of times. But it's one of his major works. You can see these books down here. These are some of the Summa Theologiae right here, as well as the Contra Gentiles. And so right to here over is Summa, if you're watching this, is the Summa Theologiae, and the ones on the right of that are the Summa Contra Gentiles. So there are a lot of works here, and written by somebody who didn't live as long as a lot of other people. So he had quite the accomplishment in his writing ability. He was an absolute brilliant person. But what did he do? So he wrote a lot. What were some of the accomplishments that he made? Well, one thing that he did was he synthesized the thought of Aristotle and Christian theology. Now, he wasn't the first person to bring in Aristotle into medieval theology or philosophy. A lot of that had been done by the Islamic thinkers as well. Some of the Syriac Christians also have been bringing Aristotle back. Aristotle's metaphysical works, his more purely philosophical works, were quote unquote lost. We had his logical works throughout much of the Middle Ages, but there was a resurgence of Aristotelian thinking and philosophy in the later Middle Ages, right around the time of Thomas Aquinas. And so there was a lot of this rebirth of Aristotle's thought going on. And Aquinas tried to apply that thinking to Christian theology. And so he did it in a lot of ways, how he viewed the nature of God, his attributes, the nature of man, the nature of just reality in general, the nature of knowledge, his view of ethics. Those are all highly influenced by Aristotle. And someone might be saying, well, how can you trust somebody who's going to bring in a pagan Greek thinker to talk about God or morality and such like that? Well, again, we can't say somebody is wrong simply because he's a Greek or quote unquote a pagan on certain issues. He's right or wrong based on whether or not what he says happens to match or correspond to reality. So, of course, we don't agree with Aristotle on a lot of things, even his views of God. We don't believe that, first of all, there are various levels of the universe where there's one pure active, the unmoved mover in every one of those. We don't think that the unmoved mover, like Aristotle thought, was completely uninterested in everything else. Rather, we believe in a personal God who's intimately interested in what we're doing and wants us to be involved with him as well. So there's a lot we don't agree with, but there's a lot that we do agree with. And so Aquinas was very successful in synthesizing Aristotle's thought with thinking in Christian theology. One of the ways he did that was in his own natural theology, which is about, again, what we can know about God from creation. And the question that he asked after he rejected the ontological argument that Anselm provided, we looked at Anselm last time in our series on these thinkers, was to say that we can't define God just the way that Anselm did, but there are ways that we can know God exists. So we're going to look at his natural theology a little bit, and that is mostly well known in his famous 5 ways. Now, if you pick up a book and you look at Thomas Aquinas, an introduction book to Thomas, or you hear about him, probably the most well-known thing he's known for is his famous 5 ways. 5 ways for what? That God exists. It's easy to find this in part 1 of the Summa Theologiae, question 2, article 3. So 1, 2, 3. And he's going to ask, is it possible to know God exists? He's going to say yes. He's going to give 5 different ways. Now I'm going to look in depth at one of them, and I'll briefly talk about the other 4, because I think there's a lot of cash value with that first way. So we're gonna look at that, and that's also going to pave the way for some of what he thinks about God's attributes, and a lot of what we've been talking about on this channel about God's attributes, whether or not he's in time or changing or not. So let's look at that. Let's look first about the first way of Thomas Aquinas. Now, bear with me. This is a long quote, and I'm breaking some quote unquote PowerPoint rules here. And I'm not showing PowerPoint per se, but this is a long quote. Bear with me. It's very rich. It's also very, very difficult if you've never heard this kind of thinking before. And it's going to bring in a lot of Aristotle. So I'm going to probably pause and come through this a little bit and try to explain it and discuss it. So he says the first and more manifest way that is to know God exists is the argument from motion. Now, let me just first stop right here and go to my promise. I'm going to stop and discuss this stuff. Motion here does not mean just inertia. So if I take our nice book here and I were to fling it across the room, it would be an inertia or movement in that regard. That's a type of change, but he's talking about change in general. He's not talking about just a baseball or a car or a bird being in movement, physical movement from here to there. He's talking about just something changing. So a leaf can change from being green to red. We can change from being shorter to taller. These are what Aristotle and Aquinas would call motion. So the first and more manifest way he says that we know God exists is for motion or change. Whenever I say motion, here change. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world, some things are in motion or changing. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. Now, these are two principles of being that are integral for both for Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. That is the notion of act and potency. You can think of act as just actually existing, and potency as being the potential to change and be something else. It comes from the Latin word potentia for power. So it just means that something in being has the power or the ability to become something else. So I have the power. I'm sitting now, but I have the power or potential to stand up. You have the power to turn your volume up or watch this or watch it again or turn it off or whatever. You have the power to do all those things. You have the power to go eat. You have the power to do all kinds of things. So you have the potential to do something you're not doing now. So to continue, but nothing, let me go back, for motion is nothing else than that reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. That's what a change means. Going from potentially being X to actually being X, whatever X stands for. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. In other words, to bring about a change, something has to already exist to bring about that change. It can't be changed from nothing. It's got to be changed from something already existing. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. So the wood is potentially hot until it's actually hot. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and in potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. So, for example, I can't both actually be sitting and potentially be sitting. I'm just actually sitting. I'm potentially standing. So I can't be both in act and potency one at the same time. He continues, for what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. Can't be cold and hot. Got to be one or the other. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, the one acting on something and the one being acted on. That is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion, whatever is changing, must be put in motion by another. If that by which is put in motion by itself be put in motion, if that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But, and this is a linchpin for all five ways, this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. So what he's saying here is we see change all around us. A thing cannot both be in act and potency in the same way. It can't change itself. It can't bring itself into being. It can't be the cause of its own change or movement. So it's got to rely on something else to bring about that change. And that requires something to be in act, bring about a change in something else that's both in act and has the potential to be changed. But one thing being in act, causing something else to be changed, cannot go on forever, he says. So there's got to be some ultimate end of this causal regression, and that thing is going to be a being of pure act. Why? Because if it were a being of pure act that also had potential, Aquinas says that that would be a being that has different metaphysical parts, and that would require to be put together in something because it's composed. Anything that's composed needs a composer. So Aquinas thinks that if a being has these different kind of philosophical parts, then it needs to be put together by something else. So there's got to be some ultimate being that's not put together by anything else. That must be pure act. Okay. So this is the argument from motion or the argument from change. And if it's successful, it shows that there is a being of pure actuality or pure existence. What pure act really means is a being that is infinite and its existence has no limits. It is not bounded by anything for its being. It is just complete existence, a complete infinite being. This is what Christians hold to for God, that God is an infinite being that he has no limits to his being, and there's no end of his being. That he's just one unified, complete being, namely a being of pure act, as Aristotle and Aquinas would both say. Now, Aristotle held that there was one pure act for every level of the universe, for example, and there were about 50 or so of those for Aristotle. Now, Aquinas rejected that, as do we. But for this universe, the one we're living in, Aquinas says that there must be an unmoved mover, a prime mover, who is ultimately responsible for all the change going on. Now, that's the first of the 5 ways. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute, because this is going to give us a lot of cash value for divine attributes in just a few minutes. But let me go through the other 4 real fast. The second is about efficient causality. And the idea here is that nothing that we experience in our world can be the cause of itself. So there's got to be something else that causes the very things that are around us to be. And there can't be an infinite regression of that backwards either. There's got to be an ultimate, what he called, efficient cause. And one of the analogies that one of my colleagues, Richard Howe, uses is that of a train. He says, well, you can explain the movement of one boxcar, one part of the train, by the movement of the one in front of it. But you can't do that forever. There's got to be something that's ultimately causing the other trains to be in movement. It's almost like a first wave example. But really, it's the example of there's got to be something bringing all that stuff into being. There's got to be something that's ultimately the efficient cause of all things that exist. And this is interesting because it's not just saying that there must be an efficient cause for the beginning of the universe, like the Kalam argument states, but it's saying there must be a here and now cause of all things that is existing. So as long as I'm talking, you hear the sound of my voice. But once I stop, then you would not hear it anymore. Or if I whistle or sang or grab my guitar and played a chord, you would hear the sound as long as the strings are vibrating. But once the strings stop vibrating, there's no more cause to that sound. Well, what Aquinas is saying is there's got to be a here and now cause that's sustaining everything in existence, not just causing it and then kind of letting go like a deistic kind of view would have. So that's the second way. The third way is an argument from contingency, which says that all things in the universe are contingent. That is, again, they can't explain their own existence. And if there was an infinite amount of time in the universe, there would have been a time, at least possibly, that all things wouldn't have existed. And there must be some necessary being that accounts for the being of all these contingent beings around us. The fourth way is an argument from gradation or perfection, that we see all these different categories of things, goodness being truth, and there must be an ultimate cause for all the species in those categories. And ultimately, that's all going to rely on one ultimate being, which would be God. And the fifth way is a way of a teleology, which sounds a lot like modern intelligent design arguments, but it's a little bit different. And what he's going to say here is that we see things around us that seem to be programmed, as it were. And one example that's given is the arrow. The arrow goes toward the target. What the arrow doesn't is it's inanimate. It doesn't have a mind of its own. It's directed toward the target by the archer. And so we see things around us that have this kind of directedness, this teleology or goal-centeredness or goal-orientedness. So to explain that, there's got to be some kind of a being that does the programming. So it's an argument for intelligent design, as it were, but a little bit different from what we see with, say, the watchmaker argument, or we see with, say, Michael Behe, Stephen Meyer, or William Dembski. So that's a little bit about his views of God in the 5 ways. Let's talk about, based on those 5 ways, we can talk about his philosophical theology. So, for example, if it is true that God is a being of pure actuality, then certain things follow from that. In fact, straight from question 2, which discusses God's existence, question 3 starts talking about his nature. So if God is an undifferentiated being, completely infinite, it has no division, then we say he is simple. Now, this has been a core doctrine throughout church history ever since at least Irenaeus explicitly. It goes beyond or before Christianity with the help with the Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, even beyond the Christians into Jewish thinking and Islamic thinking as well about their views of God. And it was a core foundational doctrine for at least most people in the Middle Ages. And that just means that God's not put together of various parts or depends on anything other than himself that exists. In other words, there's no dependency within the divinity of God. Not just that he doesn't depend on other things, which is divine aseity, but there's nothing that works together as parts to a whole in the divine essence. Put differently, whatever God has, he is. So if we say God has wisdom, knowledge, or power, then we would just say, if he's simple, he is wisdom, knowledge, and power. So we have those things accidentally or not by our nature. God has them by their nature, by his nature. And because he's infinite and simple, then there's no division or distinction, then everything he has would just be identical to him. This has been a very contentious doctrine recently, especially with thinkers like Alvin Plantinga and Bill Craig, Ryan Mullins, and folks who have attacked it. I don't want to go too far into defending all this because that will be a whole nother lesson all itself, but we'll definitely do that. I think I actually have done an article, a video on simplicity. So I do some of the objections there. I don't handle all of them. But this has been a core doctrine throughout church history. And it was part and parcel of Aquinas' philosophical theology. Not only is God simple if he's pure act, if God doesn't have potentiality, that also means he doesn't change. Because remember, to have a change, you had to have a being in act with the potential to be able to change. Well, if God has no potential and he's pure act, then he doesn't have one of the necessary ingredients for a change to happen. So it's not just that God doesn't change, it's that God cannot change, that he metaphysically is immutable and cannot change, which also means he is impassible, meaning that he is not affected by anything outside of himself, as it were, like creation. So we don't change God when we pray. We don't change God when we worship or sin. We don't affect him in those ways. You might say, well, what does that mean then? Because the Bible says that when God gets angry and jealous and all this. That would be a figure of speech for Aquinas and many thinkers in the Middle Ages and even now, saying that, well, we can say it's true that God is angry and is jealous, but what that means is it's a disposition against sin. So God is angry against sin. He's jealous about his people going after other gods, for example, in the Old Testament. But it doesn't mean literally he has a disposition that is changed by his creation, because, again, he's infinite. And if he's pure act, he doesn't have the necessary parts, as it were, to be able to change. Well, if he's not changeable, if he's immutable, that also means he's eternal. Because classically speaking, from Boethius on, if we take his definition of eternity, is the idea that anything that is changing is measured by time. That time is not a real thing in itself. Let's go back to Aristotle, actually. Much like if I took a ruler out and measured, just saw the inches on the ruler, there's never just an inch floating out there. There's always an inch of something, right? If you're measuring to put a picture up, then there's an inch of wall or an inch of the frame, but it's never just an inch, right? So we can debate the physics of time, but this classical view of time says that this is not a thing in itself. It is simply a measurement of how things change. So we say the Earth goes around the sun, and it takes 365 days to do that. It rotates on its axis. It takes 24 hours. There's not an actual hour. It's a measurement of how long it takes the Earth just to rotate. So then if God is pure being, pure act, he is immutable, impassible, and eternal. That gives you the ingredients for classical theism, that he's simple, immutable, eternal, and impassible. So again, this is why I want to give more depth to that first way, because it gives a lot of cash value. If it's sound, I think it's sound for not just that God exists, but that what he's like in some ways, that he doesn't change. He's complete, infinite being, no division. He's not changing or not affecting him. He's not in time. This is, again, the classical view of God, which of course, this channel is all about. So Aquinas also is very well known as the Angelic Doctor. He's very well known for angelology, or the study of angels, as well as demons. So he has a lot to say about angels, about how they know things. He talks a lot about what it means for them to exist in time, how they know them, how they know other beings, what can they do, what can they not do. There's a whole section in his Summa Theologiae about that, a treatise on angels. So he is known as the Angelic Doctor because he wrote so much on this topic. And there's another really important issue that Aquinas talks about in his voluminous works. It's very controversial, even among Thomists, and that is the view of analogy. That is, how does our language apply to God? Well, there's three ways that our language could apply. If I take a term that I would apply to you and me and anything else, if I just say good, for example, if I say I'm good and you're good, your cat's good, your books are good, your cheeseburger was good, your shoes are good, what does that mean? Well, we apply that term to ourselves and to God in the exact same way, which should be a univocal view. Do we apply it in a completely different way altogether, which would be equivocal? Or do we apply it in a way that's somewhat the same, but not quite exactly? That would be analogical. So there's a lot of discussion about this in theology, a lot of debate, a lot of books written even among Thomists about what analogy means, how it works. But the basic idea is that we take a word that we use for creation, and so we say that we cannot apply that to God in the exact same way that applies to creation. Because God is this, he's not just the highest being in the order of being. He's a completely distinct and separate, unique being. He's not just infinitely more than we are. He's very different. He's infinitely different than we are. He's not a human times infinity. He's a different kind of being altogether. He is a, for Aquinas, a simple, eternal, impassible, immutable, infinite, immaterial being. That's not like us at all. So we can't just say that what goodness or knowledge or power mean for me and you has the exact same meaning for God. I also don't want to say it doesn't mean anything at all, or we wouldn't be able to say anything positive about God. And a lot of what we say about God is negative. So we say this is a apophatic theology. So we say God is not composed of parts. He's not in time. He's not changeable. He's not material. He's not finite. These don't tell us what God is in himself. It tells us what he's not. All right. So this is negative theology or apophatic theology. But Aquinas thinks that we can say certain things about God that are positive, that he exists, he's being, he's good, he's true, he's beautiful. But we don't completely and capture all of what that means exactly. And how could we? There are a lot of folks who want to say if we don't have a univocal view of these terms as applied to God, then we're left with agnosticism about God. Well, I think in any view of language you take, we're going to have some level of agnosticism if we just mean I don't know what God is like in his own being, because he's an infinite being and we're a finite being. We're a finite being, so we cannot know what infinite being is. So there's some level of agnosticism no matter what view you take. But it just doesn't seem to me that we can apply the word to God in the same way that we can apply with things, for example, that are on my desk. I can say my book is good, my desk is good, my microphone is good, my cheeseburger I had for lunch was good, my shoes are good. Even among those finite things that are changeable, temporal material, the word good doesn't mean the same thing for us. To be a good pair of shoes is different than to be a good watch or to be a good computer or to be a good whatever. Because the notion or definition of good there depends on what the thing is. So since God is a different kind of thing than we are, then what it means to be good for him is different than what it means to be good for us. So lots of stuff here with Thomas Aquinas. We could have the whole channel could be nothing but Thomas Aquinas or any of the other thinkers for that matter. But where should you go? If you want to learn more about Thomas Aquinas, where should you go? There is a good resource page here on page 108 in our book. And if you don't have it, go get it. I have a link for it in the description. I would recommend the book by Ed Feser, for example, and for an intro, he says Ed Feser's book, Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, or the two biographies by Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, or F.C. Copleston. Those are both very good. Jill Soane's The Christian Philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. He's always very good. Brian Davies' Aquinas, an introduction is very good. And of course, my former professor, Norman L. Geisler, Thomas Aquinas, and Evangelical Appraisal. Those are all good. So a lot to say here about Thomas Aquinas. If you have a comment or a question, please leave that there in the comment section. If you want to say something, make a comment, a criticism, go ahead, feel free. I want you to put that in there, like and subscribe and share and all that kind of stuff. So hope you got something out of this. And if you did, please subscribe so you can get more and support the channel. And until then, we'll see you next time. Have a good one.